Makalu is a towering, majestic mountain located in the heart of the Himalayas, straddling the border between the nations of Nepal and China. Standing at a height of 8,485 meters at its summit, Makalu is the fifth highest mountain in the world and is one of only 14 summits on the planet exceeding an elevation of 8,000 meters in height. Within the mountaineering community, Makalu is considered to be one of the more difficult 8,000ers to successfully summit, as the peak is renowned for its steep slopes and razor-like ridges, which must be fearlessly circumnavigated in order to reach its summit successfully. Furthermore, Makalu is located in a remote region which is difficult to access, and the peak is prone to particularly long stretches of poor weather, and as a result, an ascent of Makalu primarily appeals to climbers with previous high-altitude climbing experience. This is likely the primary reason that, despite sporting a reputation of being one of the hardest of the 8,000ers to successfully ascend, Makalu has seen less deaths on its slopes than Cho Oyu, which is widely considered to be the easiest of the 8,000ers to ascend. However, while the overall skill level of summit hopefuls attempting to reach Makalu's summit is generally quite high, sometimes even the most skilled veteran mountaineers fall victim to the many perils of the mountains. By the year 2005, Makalu would stand as one of the last remaining 8,000ers that had still yet to be ascended during the wintertime, as due to the particularly harsh and brutally cold weather conditions experienced on Makalu's slopes during the winter months, a winter ascent of the peak had long been considered a near suicidal prospect to undertake, as the difficult, high-altitude climbing conditions on its slopes would only be further exacerbated for any potential summit hopefuls, while also contending with the frigid wintertime weather. And thus, the risks to attempt such a climb were too great for a large majority of mountaineers with the proficiency and technical abilities to potentially successfully accomplish a wintertime ascent. However, in December of 2005, one such mountaineer who certainly possessed the technical skills and, equally importantly, the ironclad will to brave Makalu's slopes in the dead of winter would gear up for an ambitious solo ascent attempt to become the first man to successfully summit Makalu during the winter. The name of this ambitious veteran French mountaineer will be a familiar one to anyone who has watched my previous video on the channel detailing the 1992 French Annapurna expedition disaster, Jean-Christophe Lafall. If you haven't yet watched that video, I suggest you do so if you'd like additional context about the deadly events that transpired on Annapurna's infamous south face in 1992. However, as it's quite relevant to this story as well, I'll briefly recap Jean-Christophe's harrowing ordeal on Annapurna to catch everyone up to speed, as the incident would mark a turning point in his climbing career. While attempting an ascent of Annapurna's south face with his expedition team's leader, a man named Pierre Béguin, the pair were caught off guard by a series of surprise storms as they arduously ascended Annapurna, with the duo reaching an elevation of 7,400 meters before ultimately deciding to call off their summit bid and retreat back to base camp. Unfortunately, while the pair were descending at an elevation of approximately 7,100 meters, Pierre was suddenly sent plummeting 1,500 meters down Annapurna's slopes to his death below after he was struck by falling rocks, which also consequently broke Jean-Christophe's hand and forearm. After waiting out the storm for several days at an elevation of 7,000 meters, Jean-Christophe would make an incredible, rather miraculous descent by himself during the nighttime, all the way back to his expedition team's advanced base camp at an elevation of 5,300 meters, only to find it completely destroyed by an avalanche. Ultimately, he was rescued by a Slovenian team almost an entire day later and was successfully evacuated to a nearby hospital for medical treatment. After he had recovered from the injuries he'd sustained on Annapurna, Jean-Christophe would swear off mountaineering entirely, as his close brush with death had rattled his resolve to continue climbing mountains. However, Jean-Christophe would seemingly reignite his passion for spending time in the mountains when he began scrambling in the Alps, which, scrambling, if you don't know, is a sport I detailed much more in depth in my video about Bailey Mulholland, but to explain it very simply, it's essentially like the middle point between hiking and rock climbing. Jean-Christophe's scrambling excursions would not only reignite his love of the mountains, but would also serve to rekindle his confidence for mountaineering, and he would go on to complete a successful ascent of a difficult, unclimbed route up Petit Dru in the Alps, which subsequently became known as the La Fall route less than a year after his miraculous descent of Annapurna, and it wasn't long before Jean-Christophe again found himself drawn to the siren song of climbing in the Himalayas, and would go on to complete a successful ascent of the 8,188-meter peak Cho Oyu in 1993. The following year in 1994, Jean-Christophe would again return to the gargantuan mountains of the Himalayas to undertake one of his most ambitious ascents of an 8,000er to date, when he decided to tap into his previous harrowing experience climbing alone that he gained on Annapurna to attempt a solo ascent of a new route up the north face of the 8,027-meter peak Shishapangma. Jean-Christophe would succeed in his efforts to reach the summit and established his new route up the north face. Following this ascent, Jean-Christophe was pleased with his performance while solo climbing, and he would go on to attempt an even more ambitious series of solo ascents 2 years later in 1996, when he would attempt to consecutively ascend 2 8,000ers by himself, the 8,080-meter Gasherbrum 1 and the 8,035-meter Gasherbrum 2, all within the span of just 4 days. Jean-Christophe would indeed manage to succeed in his efforts to do so, which would only further add to his impressive solo climbing resume. Despite his successes in the Himalayas following Pierre Béguin's death and his subsequent harrowing ordeal on Annapurna's slopes in 1992, Jean-Christophe would find himself still haunted by that fateful climb, as he would later confide to his wife that he had taken to solo climbing because he didn't want to have to witness another one of his climbing partners die again. Furthermore, Jean-Christophe also found himself haunted by his failure to reach Annapurna's summit during that ill-fated 1992 expedition, and he began to grow obsessed with reaching its summit, and before long, he would again find himself drawn to Annapurna's mighty slopes to undertake a solo attempt to ascend the peak's infamous south face. However, again, Jean-Christophe would find himself repelled by foul weather conditions on its slopes, and he was forced to subsequently abandon his bid for the summit. Following his failure to reach Annapurna's summit successfully once more, Jean-Christophe's obsession with Annapurna would only further deepen, and in 1998, he would spurn attempting the ascent without teammates as he'd grown accustomed to over the previous few years, and opted to join a larger expedition team attempting an ascent of the south face. However, much like the last time he had attempted to ascend Annapurna as part of a larger expedition team, the team's efforts would end in failure following the death of one of the team's members, who was swept up within a powerful avalanche that cascaded down Annapurna's south face. This result would, unsurprisingly, once again steer Jean-Christophe away from attempting ascents as part of a multi-member expedition team and back towards solo ascents. However, His obsession with completing an ascent of Annapurna would remain strong over the following years, and he would once again return to the peak in the year 2002 with his climbing partner Alberto Indurategui to attempt an ascent of the peak via the peak's elongated eastern ridge. This attempt would at last result in Jean-Christophe's success as he reached the summit in triumph, marking his personal pinnacle of his climbing career, but at the same time leaving a void in his goals for the future as a mountaineer. The next year in 2003, Jean-Christophe would announce that he would attempt to successfully summit all 14 8,000-meter peaks in the world, which would cement his legacy as one of the rare few climbers who have managed to accomplish such an enormous undertaking. However, Jean-Christophe was undoubtedly an accomplished, veteran, high-altitude climber, and so he sought to further add to the difficulty of accomplishing his goals by attempting to accomplish his ascents on these peaks by rather unconventional means, opting to attempt to do so by ascending routes that deviated from the standard routes of ascent, solo. Only further adding to the challenge of these ascents, Jean-Christophe would seek to ascend these mighty mountains through the most brutal conditions possible during the wintertime. That same year in 2003, he would get off to a strong start at accomplishing his goal with 3 consecutive ascents of Nanga Parbat, Dhaulagiri, and Broad Peak before the year had come to a close. In December of 2004, Jean-Christophe would again return to the slopes of Shishapangma to attempt another solo ascent of the peak, and the first winter ascent of the peak as well. He would again reach Shishapangma's summit successfully on December 11th. However, to his dismay, his ascent would not be recognized as the first winter ascent of the peak, as he had completed it before the calendar start of winter following the winter solstice on December 21st. Thus, he vowed not to make the same mistake during his next wintertime ascent the following year in 2005, which would mark his 12th 8,000er, the 8,485-meter behemoth, Makalu, to attempt the ambitious first winter ascent of the peak alone. In late December of 2005, Jean-Christophe would arrive at the foot of Makalu's looming slopes, which were caked with a thick layer of wintertime snow, in order to embark on his ambitious summit attempt, and he immediately set to work establishing his advanced base camp at an elevation of 5,300 meters, from which he would begin to slowly make his way up the mountainside, establishing his camps along his route, while continuously hauling gear from advanced base camp up to these camps, while simultaneously acclimatizing to the high altitude. A laborious and time-consuming process, which would continue throughout the remainder of 2005 and into January of 2006. Jean-Christophe would launch his first bid for the summit during the first week of January, and would manage to reach the Makalu La Col, where he was lashed by fierce winds, which destroyed his tent and were so strong that they literally blew him up into the air twice while he was climbing. However, undeterred in his ambition to reach the summit, and confident in his ability to do so successfully, Jean-Christophe would retreat to his base camp to wait out the foul weather that enveloped Makalu's mighty slopes. He would patiently wait for the weather to clear for a further 2 weeks before another window to attempt to ascend the peak would arise in late January, and he would excitedly inform his wife on January 23rd that he planned to set off for the summit the following day. On the morning of January 24th, 2006, Jean-Christophe would set off from his advanced base camp at 5,300 meters and began to make his way up Makalu's slopes towards the summit. Contending with the brutal wintertime conditions on the peak, he would make slow but consistent progress up his planned route over the course of the following few days, and by the evening of January 26th, he had reached an approximate elevation of 7,500 meters, where he decided to bivvy overnight on a small ledge, from which he planned to make his final push to the summit the following day on January 27th. On the morning of January 27th, Jean-Christophe would contact his team at base camp as well as his wife on his satellite phone to update them on his progress up the mountain, as well as his intent to make his final push for the summit that day. However, following these phone calls, Jean-Christophe Lafall would never be seen or heard from again, as he would seemingly vanish during his final push for the summit. After he had failed to further contact both his team at base camp and his wife at their previously agreed upon times, concern for Jean-Christophe's well-being would begin to mount. However, both parties were aware that if something had befallen him, there was essentially nothing that could be done to save him, as due to his extreme altitude, there were no potential rescue climbers anywhere nearby that were acclimatized to such extreme altitudes that could be dispatched to search for him. And furthermore, even if there had been any attempt to rescue him, these efforts would have come attached with huge risks due to the brutal wintertime conditions on Makalu's slopes, and thus there was little to do but wait and hope that Jean-Christophe could make another miraculous descent against the odds. However, as the days passed, without any further trace of him, any remaining hope that he was alive would quickly begin to wane, and was all but extinguished when another foul weather system engulfed the peak in another raging blizzard, and his remaining team members at base camp would abandon all hope of his survival and subsequently retreated back to civilization a week following his initial disappearance. When the foul weather had cleared enough to allow for it, a helicopter search for Jean-Christophe's remains was conducted by local officials. However, no trace of him was spotted during their search efforts, and they were soon thereafter called off. Jean-Christophe Lafall was a highly accomplished veteran climber who, like many who fit such a description, ultimately would meet his end in the solitude of the unforgiving mountains he treasured so much, as he would describe his attraction to climbing in an almost self-prophesizing interview in the weeks preceding his death, stating, quote, "I find it fascinating that our planet still has areas where no modern technology can save you, where you are reduced to your most basic and essential self. This natural space creates demanding situations that can lead to suffering and death, but also generate a wild interior richness. Ultimately, there is no way of reconciling these contradictions. All I can do is try to live within their margins, in the narrow boundary between joy and horror. Everything on this earth is a balancing act," he remarked. Thank you all for watching.